It started with the fact that old Earl, the owner of the rottenest barn in the area, was found in a ditch off Highway 377. His body was torn apart as if a combine harvester had passed through him. The sheriff attributed it to a pack of feral dogs, but the locals whispered, "That's him. A dog's head." The legend of the dog's head has been told for decades. It was said that in the 50s, the military tested drugs in these places to increase the endurance of soldiers. One of the subjects, a former prisoner named Dog, escaped into the woods after drugs turned his skin into scaly armor and his teeth into spikes. Since then, he has been seen here and there, a two-legged silhouette with an elongated muzzle, howling at the moon. But the real nightmare began when children began to disappear in the neighborhood. Rachel arrived in the town 3 days ago. Her brother, Cody, disappeared after a party at the quarry. The police did nothing, so she searched the forest herself until she came across an old military base. Abandoned hangars, rusty barrels labeled biohazard, and footprints. Too big for a dog, too deep for a human. At night, she was awakened by a knock on the window. On the windowsill was Cody's toy, a stuffed wolf with its belly ripped open. There was a finger inside. Child. Mark, the local mechanic, agreed to help. His son disappeared 2 years ago. All this time he was collecting data, photos from surveillance cameras, radar recordings, scraps of cloth with fangs. "It's not an animal," he said, spreading the map out in front of Rachel. "Look, all the losses are along the old gas pipeline. It leads to the mines." They set off in Mark's truck. On the way, he told how 10 years ago he got a job at a construction site in the forest. They worked at night, wearing hard hats with tinted windows. They were building something underground. One dude ran away. He was caught, but when the handcuffs were removed, his hands were scarred. It was as if he was gnawing on himself. The mine turned out to be a trap. The elevator crashed down as soon as they entered. The ground smelled of formalin and rotten meat. The walls were covered with bloody claw marks. "It's not a dog's head," Rachel whispered, shining her flashlight at the cages. "They have bones in collars." Mark found a diary with the logo of a private military company. Last entry, sample number 12 shows aggression. "I had to eliminate the staff. We recommend flooding the mine." Then they heard a growl. He came out of the shadows, hunched over, in tatters of his uniform. His face was hidden by a mask of leather and wire, but his eyes were human. Crazy, but human. Rachel took a step forward, but Mark pulled her away. The dog's head was holding a knife in his hand. The blade glistened with fresh blood. "He's not your brother. That's what they turned him into." Mark pushed Rachel into a side tunnel. "Run." His scream doomed the echo. Rachel ran, stumbling over the bones, until she fell into the pit. At the bottom is a room with monitors. On the screens, children in cages, men in black uniforms injecting syringes into them. And Cody. They tied him to a table while howling was coming from the speakers. She woke up from the cold. The water was rising up to my ankles. The dog's head was standing over her, holding Mark's head. The mask came off, revealing a face covered with tumors and scars. "They made U.S. watchmen." The creature wheezed. "You're next." Rachel hit him with a crowbar. The bone cracked, but the dog's head laughed. "I'm not in charge." The water gushed out with a roar. The last thing Rachel saw was figures in black descending on cables. She was found a week later, in a condition that even pathologists refused to describe. She survived. But when the sheriff brought her to the station to identify her brother, she screamed. Cody was in the cell. His skin was covered with black stitches, his teeth were sharpened, and in his hand was a stuffed wolf. He smiled and said in the voice of a dog's head, "Sister, you're part of the pack now. Rachel staggered back, hitting her back against the cell bars. Cody stood up slowly, his movements unnatural, like bones creaking on hinges. They implanted his voice in me. His memory. He touched the scar on his neck, from where a piece of wire protruded. But I'm not him. I'm better. The sheriff laughed behind her back. When Rachel turned around, he took off his hat, revealing the absence of his left ear. In its place was a metal implant with a red LED. Welcome to the updated Phoenix Project, Ms. Graves. The cell door slammed shut. Cody handed her a knife, the handle of which was wrapped in hair. Choose whether to join or become fertilizer for the next batch. Rachel stabbed him in the stomach with the blade. Instead of blood, a black gel flowed out. Cody growled, grabbing her by the throat. It's a pity. You could have been the queen of the pack. She was thrown into a truck with barred windows. There are other refuseniks inside. A man without a lower jaw. A girl with extra arms sewn to her shoulders. Everyone was silent except for one teenager, who was continuously banging his head against the wall. They're taking us to the factory, the woman with the upturned eyelids whispered. They'll clean it up. The truck stopped at a building that looked like a giant refrigerator. The inscription on the wall, Blackthorn Biorecycling. The cleaning process turned out to be mechanical. People were led one by one into a room with a conveyor belt. Robotic arms with saws and crushers took them apart. Bones into an acid bin, meat into a protein bar press, organs into glass cylinders labeled biofuels. Rachel pretended to be submissive and allowed the studded collar to be put on. She was taken to a workshop where stable samples collected weapons from body scraps. Cody's hand was on the table, now with a welded blade instead of a hand. Find me, the collar whispered suddenly. Cody's voice. They don't control the minds. There's a heart. The escape was a success thanks to a suicidal teenager. He detonated a grenade hidden in an empty eye socket. In the chaos, Rachel slipped out into the ventilation. The mines turned out to be alive. The walls pulsed like flesh, and the pipes writhed like intestines. Screams filled the air, a recording of the suffering of thousands of victims sewn into the ventilation. At the epicenter, she found a heart, a giant bioreactor made of fused bodies. Her mother's face flashed among them. We're all part of the menu, Cody said, stepping out of the shadows. His body was now fused to the reactor mechanism. They're feeding it to new soldiers. Our fear is the most delicious sauce. Rachel grabbed an axe that was lying in a pile of bones. I'll set you free. No, he smiled, and the reactor hummed. You'll feed us. Half-human hybrids with saws instead of hands and stingers instead of tongues climbed out of the walls. The last thing Rachel managed to do was cut the main pipe. The explosion destroyed the factory. Survivors said they saw two people come out of the fire, a woman with a burned face and a creature holding her hand. A month later, new lunches appeared in school canteens. The children complained of a metallic taste. The labels read, fortified protein, approved by Blackthorn. And in the forest, near the destroyed mine, they still find toy wolves. If you tear it up, there will be a note inside. Thanks for the food. Love Pack. He didn't move like humans. His steps resembled the clicks of broken branches, short, sharp, with pauses, as if the bones were shifting inside the body. When he came out of the shadows, the first thing the victims noticed was the smell. Sweet, like spoiled honey, with an admixture of rotting apples. It smelled like chemicals that had been sprayed on him in the cage to stop tissue rejection. The face, if you could call it a face, was hidden by a mask of rough leather stitched with tendons. But underneath it is a network of tubes implanted directly into the skull. Some pumped cloudy fluid into the veins, while others pumped pus from infected wounds. When he breathed, the tubes hissed like snakes. The arms were longer than a human's, with double joints. The fingers ended not with nails, but with surgical blades bolted to the phalanges. There are scars on the palms. Letters, Beeb 12. The label of the sample from the 12th batch. The voice is the main weapon. He was able to imitate other people's voices, thanks to a chip implanted in his larynx. When he called the victim's name, the sound came from all directions at once, like an echo from a dungeon. But if you listened carefully, there was a creak in the intonation, as if old gears were grinding words. The clothes are scraps of a military uniform soaked in blood and pus. There is a patch with a half-erased inscription on the chest. The Dog-Headed Guardian. Protocol 66-inch. In his pockets he kept trophies, children's teeth wrapped in candy wrappers, and photographs of victims before transformation. The method of killing is a ritual. First, he broke the victim's fingers, putting a piece of coal into each fracture. To make hell burn brighter, he once explained to a surveillance camera, although no one asked. Then he ripped open his stomach, but did not touch the organs. Instead, he carved patterns on the skin, spirals like on his own scars. Weakness is light. The fluorescent lights made his skin bubble. An entry was found in Blackthorn's diary. Photosensitization is a side effect of Formula Number 9. Therefore, he hunted only at night, and during the day he hid in tanks with black slime, which slowed down the decay. The last detail is the scariest. When he was finally killed, shot in the base of the skull, worms flowed out of the wound. White, blind, grown in a laboratory to devour necrotic tissue. They continued to squirm, even being crushed by the sheriff's boot. It became clear that the dog's head wasn't the only nightmare released by Blackthorn. The town turned out to be a battlefield for a whole brood of creatures, each the result of a separate protocol. New monster, the Whisperer Spider. He was found in an abandoned school. Long, bony limbs sticking out of the human torso like the paws of a spider. The face was a mask made of leather, sewn so tightly that the seams dug into the flesh. But the scariest thing is his ability to inject victims with the drug of truth. Those who survived the bite began to see hallucinations, the memories of other victims, the faces of the missing, and sometimes their own futures. Mrs. Clark, the librarian, was the first to be found after meeting the Whisperer Spider. She was sitting in the reading room, surrounded by books with torn pages. On her hands were written formulas identical to those found in Blackthorn's diary. When the sheriff tried to take her away, she screamed, "They're in the water! They're in the water!" The water tower turned out to be the next key. Dozens of bodies were floating in the tank, connected to tubes. Each is a hybrid of a human and a machine. LEDs with the numbers Beeb 13, Beeb 14, Beeb 15 were lit on their chests. Rachel, still hiding in the woods, found the diary of a traitorous scientist. Last entry. The Spider Protocol has failed. The samples lose control. I recommend flooding the zone. P.S. They know I'm writing this. They're in the walls. That night, her hideout was attacked. Not a dog's head or a spider. It looked like a child, with its face wrapped in bandages. His hands ended in scalpels. "Mom," the creature whispered in Cody's voice. "Play with me." Rachel fired, but the bullets only tore off the bandages. There was no face under them, just teeth growing out of the sockets. Rachel retreated, stumbling over the roots until her back rested against the trunk of a pine tree. A creature with teeth instead of eyes slithered after her, scratching the bark with finger blades. "Mom missed you." It clicked its tongue like a coiled razor. The shot rang out unexpectedly. The creature's head shattered into pieces, revealing a steel skull with microchips. A man in a ragged raincoat came out of the darkness with a shotgun in his hands. His face was hidden by a bark mask. "Run before they smell blood," he croaked, disappearing into the thicket. Rachel ran after him without asking any questions. The shelter turned out to be a bunker under a burnt-out church. There are maps, photographs, and wires connected to an old military server on the walls. The stranger took off his mask, revealing a face disfigured by burns and scars from stitches. "I'm Jacob, former Blackthorn engineer. They implanted a chip in me so that I could fix them." He pointed at the screen, where images of the hybrids flashed. The dog's head, the whispering spider. "These are flowers. The prickly mother will wake up tonight. She lived in a greenhouse hidden under a cemetery. Her body is a fusion of flesh and genetically modified flora. The veins were replaced by vines with thorns releasing neurotoxin. The victims, having been pricked, began to see her children. Half plants, half corpses that grew out of the ground like mushrooms after rain. She was a scientist. Jacob brought up a photo of a woman with glasses. Dr. Alice Wayne. She developed biofertilizer for Blackthorn, until she merged with her own creation. Rachel agreed to a crazy plan. Break into the greenhouse and burn the spores of the prickly mother before they get into the plumbing. Jacob gave her an ampoule with a poison inhibitor for plant DNA. If you inject it into the base of the stem, it will slow it down for an hour. No more. The greenhouse greeted them with silence. The glass walls were covered with black flowers with the smell of decay. The air was thick with spores that glowed like sparks in the dark. "Don't breathe," Jacob said, putting on his gas mask. "Spores germinate in the lungs in 20 seconds. They were walking between flower beds, pits where people were stuck up to their necks in the ground. Their mouths were filled with dirt, and orchids were growing out of their eye sockets. Prickly Mother was waiting in the center. Her lower body fused with the tree trunk, her arms turned into flexible whips with thorns. Instead of hair, there are roots reaching down to the floor." "Jacob." Her voice sounded like the rustle of leaves. "Have you come to give me your body? It will serve as a good fertilizer." He fired, but the vines caught the shot, licking off the metal. Rachel threw the ampoule with the inhibitor, and the greenhouse exploded in green fire. She woke up in the river. Jacob is dead, with mushrooms sprouting through his chest. There is a dictaphone in the pocket of his raincoat. Last entry. If you're hearing this, it means I've become part of the garden. The prickly mother is not the main one. She's just a pot for what grows beneath us. The roots go into the mines. There's a live reactor. He feeds on fear. Rip out his heart. Rachel climbed out onto the shore. The water underfoot was bubbling with bloody foam. There's a fresh footprint in the sand. Not a human being. Not a beast. Something in between. It was watching her from the forest. 6 eyes. 3 mouths. Bone plates instead of skin. There is a brand on his forehead, B0. Rachel crawled towards the forest, shivering from the cold and pain. It, B0, did not pursue her, only followed her with twinkling eyes as if waiting. She found a hunting lodge at the edge of the forest. Inside there is warm food on the stove, a loaded pistol on the table, and a walkie-talkie. Too perfect to be true. "Turn on the radio," hissed the voice in her head. Cody's voice. She pressed the button. "Rachel, this is Tom. I'm from the Resistance. We're coming to you. Hold on." An hour later, a jeep stopped at the cabin. 2 people got out of it, a man with a bear and a girl with a rifle. "You're alive." Tom hugged her. "We blew up their lab in the north. Left." He didn't finish. Rachel felt her hand reach for the gun of its own accord. "No," she managed to whisper before the bullet tore through Tom's throat. The girl raised her rifle, but Rachel shot her in the knee, then in the stomach. Warm blood splattered on the walls. "Wait. What are you doing?" The girl screamed, crawling towards the door. Rachel stepped on her back. "They're in my head." Sobbing, she put the gun to the back of the victim's head. "I'm sorry." Shot. B0 entered the cabin. His mouth stretched into a kind of smile. "Good girl." Now you are our best shepherd dog." It threw a photograph at her feet. It shows her grandmother sleeping in an armchair. There was a mark on the old woman's chest, target number 41. The choice is simple, the chip creaked in her brain. Kill her, or we'll send Cody to her. Rachel entered the house. The knife was shaking in her hand. Grandma turned around. Her wrinkled face lit up with a smile that crumbled in horror when she saw her granddaughter's eyes, glassy like a fish on a counter. "I'm sorry," Rachel gasped, stabbing into the blade. But at the last moment, the hand jerked to the side. The knife pierced a photograph on the wall, a picture of Rachel and Cody as children, where they laugh by the river. Grandma fell to the floor, covering her head with her hands. Rachel hissed, grinding her teeth in pain. The chip in her temple burned like a red-hot nail. "They're in your phone." Grandma, trembling, crawled up to the table. The phone contains a voice message from an unknown person, a cipher and coordinates. A rumble outside. Beeb Zero was breaking down the door. Rachel pulled out her gun and shot herself in the temple. Click. A misfire. "Honey," B Zero's voice came through the walls. "We've disabled all your toys." Rachel collapsed to her knees. Grandma disappeared into the basement, slamming the hatch. "Don't worry," Beeb Zero hugged her shoulders like a loving father. "They'll find her. In the meantime, we have a new mission for you." It handed her a folder. Inside there are photos of politicians, scientists, and journalists. On the cover, Phase 2, Infection of the Elites. Post-credit scene. A lab somewhere in Europe. A man in a suit signs a contract with the Blackthorn logo. "The Global Flock Project has been approved," he says, injecting himself with a syringe filled with black liquid. In the mirror, his reflection blinks with 6 eyes.